Alrighty. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rainer72 and I'm here to airbrush a little bit with you all tonight. We're going to be following up a little bit on what we discussed in our first class last month and move into something a little bit more advanced. We're going to talk about gradients and modulation a little bit tonight. If you're wondering what exactly that means, if you've ever seen something like scale tanks, larger minis and things like that, where there's a lot of shadow and light built into your mini over the area of things like panels, or how light and color shift and transition over a model. That's what we're focused on tonight. So we want to be able to build those gradients and build those transitions. So there's a couple of things that we can look at doing. And I'm going to break out a couple of examples here, and we'll play around with them tonight. There's two main things that we normally paint when we're talking about well, anything. Usually we have inorganic materials and we have organic materials. Inorganic materials, kind of like the armor plating here on this mini right here, are nice and flat and smooth. And we can enhance the look of those a bit by adding a little bit of that modulation and gradient to it. What that adds to it is a bit of volume, meaning it gives the mini itself a bit more like actual volume. It looks like recesses are more recessed. It also will look like high points stand out more, etc. And it can also just add a lot of character. It can add some weathering to it, and it can also define the way that your light is facing the mini. So let's talk about a few basic concepts and start off kind of where I'm going to take you tonight. One of the main things to point out is that the two example pieces that I've pulled out for tonight, I've base coated in black. That's not necessarily always what you want to do. It's based more on which colors that you want to build to. And the reason that I'm bringing this up now is that one of the primary aspects that you'll want to think about when you're building your airbrush layers, and especially when you're trying to build a modulation into that layer, you'll want to be very aware of what the previous layer has done. So even with normal painting, acrylic paints, and that's the focus tonight, acrylic paints tend to be somewhat translucent. They let a little bit of light through. They don't completely cover. So by having this set at a basic black level, we're starting with a very dark undertone, and we're going to build our value, our light, along with the color itself. So that's part of how I build modulation. You can start a little bit differently. A lot of people will also start with a gray primer. That way, if you start with gray, you have to build more of your shadow into it to get a little bit more of that volume. But that's perfectly acceptable. It just depends on where you're starting and what color you want. A lot of colors go well over black, although some colors just tend to show up a little bit easier over something like gray or white. So to get started, let's take a quick look at something basic. This bloat drone is pretty basic in its armor panel. So we're going to look at that part specifically, and then we're going to move on and we're going to look at this Karanak model here. He's a nice little organic doggy. And we'll take a look at how we would go about modulating something organic like this, since it's a little bit different. That being said, let's start off. First things first, always want to wear a mask. Keep that nasty particulate out of our lungs. So let me get that going. Let me also charge up our compressor. We'll get that moving as well, and I'm going to load my airbrush. So the basic color scheme for this bloat drone, it's going to be very bright green. Let me give you an example of the greens that we're talking about. And here's the exact same mini in a more completed manner. You can see where we have the green laid down on this, on the armor panels, and how that green itself changes in intensity and in light in different areas. So if you take a look right on the front, you'll notice that this area down here is quite a bit more shadowy than this area up here. The same thing applies along the top ridges. Let me make sure I show that to you all nicely. And you can see bits of shadow hinted at in the paint as we go down these ridges of armor panels that are overlapping. And we can also see how we've changed the shadow and light around the edges of this round piece, and that's to indicate where our light is actually hitting. The big thing to point out here is that none of this is black. We haven't left any areas completely black, and that's an important thing. This goes back to the saturation aspect. One of the first things that you'll want to do is not necessarily completely cover your area with your color, but you'll want to saturate it to a point where the following layers themselves play off of the original color. The airbrush is a particularly good tool for this sort of method, just for the fact that it lays down pretty thin layers if you thin your paint down appropriately. And it's really easy to get just a hint of green everywhere without making the entire model green. So what I'm going to do to start off here, I've got out a little bit of our Scale 75 Misfits green. It's from the Undead Flesh Tone, and I like to use this as a basic green. It's basically just a kind of a forest green, and this is the same color that we started with before. If you've seen me airbrush before, I usually use a very thin down mixture of my paint. So I've put in about 50-50 of the Misfits green and Vallejo Flow Improver into the mix. And I'm just going to mix that up in the cup. One of the other things that I'll point out later is how we sour mash our paints, and we reuse the previous paints a little bit as we change. So just keep in mind that what we're starting out here is a very deep foresty green. So here's the fun part. I haven't painted any of the rest of the model, so I'm kind of free to overspray wherever I need to. The airbrush has a nice quality to it in that it has a very soft, undefined application. So I'm sorry, hold on a second. I've got a fly. It's been attracted to my Nurgling. Not kind of distracting. So let's see, make sure you can see this as I apply it. I'm taking this very thin. I'm barely pulling back the trigger on my airbrush and giving it as much air as I possibly can so it can dry as it goes. But the big important thing here is that all of my panels are at least going to get a spritz. Even though there might not be much green appearing, if you look at what I'm doing on the paper underneath, you can see how that green builds very slowly. That's the kind of rate that I'm talking about on the Mini. So while you might not necessarily see it at this stage, I'm getting all of the panels a little bit of green. Now the other aspect of what I'm going to do here to get this modulation going is I mentioned that we're emulating the way that light falls on the Mini itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify parts of the Mini where I want light to show up more, or to be more intense, where it's striking parts of the Mini itself. You saw where I did that on the previous example. Sorry, I'm just moving this out of my paint range so I don't accidentally paint it. But you can see where I've had light more intense and light less intense. Not all of the lighting is realistic here, but it somewhat follows the same direction. If you're wanting to set the direction of that light for your highlights, now's the time to start thinking about it. So even though we're applying a little bit of green to the entirety of this panel here, I'm going to focus it where I know I'm going to build more light, because I know I'm going to build more layers over it, and those layers are going to need that undercoat to actually show through. So you notice I took a little bit of a stylistic approach, and I went top and bottom on these turbines here.
And I'm a little off on my camera tonight. I apologize, just because I've got a little bit of a different setup than normal, so I'm not painting upside down. But taking it nice and quick, nice and easy, getting it covered, and I'm not worried about overspray. Overspray is when you hit part of the Mini with a little bit of paint that you don't want to, and you get a little bit of a fuzzy look to it. That's okay right now. Basically anything else is going to get painted over at this point, so it's whatever. Don't get too hung up about putting a little bit of green paint someplace where you're going to put something else. A little bit out of focus there. So like I said, on this model itself, I'm just focusing on the armor panels. I'm taking it super slow. And I want to focus on that lighting again. So I'm gonna briefly go over the edges here. One thing I'm really gonna point out when I do this. This is another thing to look at when you're building shadows. Utilize those undercoats. Utilize your shadow and your primer and stuff like that. What I'm doing here is something I like to call shooting the tangent. When I spray over the tops of these ridges, there's a lot of dimension to them. You'll notice that what I've left here is a little bit of shadow, a little bit more primer than green. And by spraying over the top in this direction, where my pinky finger is going, we get that over the tops of the ridges, and we leave that shadow in the recess. If you want a more traditional painting analogy, it's kind of like dry brushing with the airbrush. So it may not look very green, but we've got our base coat, and we've got a nice saturated tone down for the different parts. Let's get a little bit of green here. A little bit of green here. Oops, mask. Always got to check the mask. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to look realistic unless you're going for realistic. Sometimes it looks better just to play around with it a little bit. It's totally up to you and what you want and what your taste is. So nice and easy. We'll take it from there. So I've got a little bit of I've got a bit of our green paint left. We've used about half of it. I'm gonna rinse this out, but I will be leaving the paint in here that's left after I rinse it. I'm just gonna give it a quick squirt. And I dump the cup out upside down and spray it a little bit. And I've got this much paint left in it. I don't know if that's super visible. Let me pull this light around here. There we go. It's basically just a thin little bit of paint left. I'm gonna use that. So we're gonna go ahead and add our flow improver back in, just a smidge. We're gonna move to our next color. This happens to be Iosin green for P3. So I'm just gonna mix that up real quick. And just as before, I'm doing about a 50-50 mix, so 1-2 drops in there. That should be plenty. Doesn't take much to get the saturation that we need, especially through an airbrush, and especially when we're taking thin layers, you don't need much paint at all. Quick comparison before we start this particular part of the gradient. You can see this is the one where we've applied green. Got a bit of green highlight to it, and then this is the one where we have flat black. You can notice that there's a hue, not so much. And my mask is slipping off. Oh, good grief. It's a heck of a night. Alright, get that mixed up. Here we go. So we're gonna do what we just did with our next color. We're going to focus on the areas where we want more light. So I'm going to focus the light at a top down, kind of approaching it this way. We're going to want light here where the fly symbol is and along the ridges, and then we'll add some stylistic light here and here and along these back two panels. So basically the idea is to get concentrically smaller as you go. So if you're thinking about it in a very 2D sense, you start big, right? And then your next layer gets a little smaller, and then your next layer gets a little smaller. And this is basically what modulation is. It's not always the same shape, so that's something to keep in mind. But
that might be something for a different class. For now, just try to emulate, and it's a good way to start, just to emulate what you see in real life. And if you need reference pictures, it doesn't hurt to Google. Let's go right up front. I'm taking it super, super thin, so barely pulling back on the trigger. We're going to shoot the tangent. And you can see that that spray is building up slowly over that. Might be a little dark. Go away, fly. Or I spray you. Got an annoying little guest tonight. And we'll hit the ridges of those panels. Don't be afraid to try a little bit of detail work, especially with an airbrush. It's a very imprecise tool. Even though it seems like it might be a precision tool, it's not. And we're just going to add a little bit more of that Iosin green here. So you can see how the previous green has kind of reinforced what we needed here. We needed way less of the Iosin green to build an actual color. And we're also focusing that down more towards where we want the actual light. So I spent a lot less time there getting these panels blocked in with that color than I did on the previous one. So these layers theoretically should keep going quicker and quicker until you're done. Oh, good grief. It's gotten a bit warm up here. Try not to kick on the AC tonight, but might have to. So this my studio room gets a little bit warm with the compressor running and all of the streaming gear. So fun stuff. There we go. Taking that very easy, very light. Again, we don't mind if we get a little bit of overspray. We'll just go back in and cut in the details later. And by cutting in the details, I mean going back in with a hand brush and doing detail work. I don't know where I picked that up from, but it's like going in with a feels like it's going in with a knife and doing some delicate work. It's kind of how I think of it. The fun part is if you're a little bit newer to airbrushing and you haven't really done an airbrush project yet. Cutting in the details is like 80% of the time. So, for example, I'm gonna finish painting out this bloat drone at some point. I just want to use this as an example tonight because it's a really good example of flat panels and getting some depth out of them. But there's going to be a lot of time spent afterwards blocking in other colors, metallics, purples, yellows, etc. Doing a bit of weathering, chipping, what have you. These are things that you can't really emulate well with an airbrush. There are techniques, obviously, but sometimes it's just easier to get out a brush and start doing a little bit of this and that. Now, if you really want to get into some advanced techniques as well, as far as like a technical technique, you can always look into something like chipping. If you've ever seen anybody use chipping medium before, or something along those lines, it's easier than it looks, but it's really nice with an airbrush because you get to apply those layers nice and smoothly and easily. But yeah, for the most part, a lot of weathering and stuff is done after the airbrush steps. There are certain things you can do to set it up. Again, with gradients, you can start working in like neutral tones to set up for dirt and grime and things like that. But usually that's beyond that. So let's take another look between baseline. This is our completely unpainted primed mini. And then this is what we built so far with 2 layers. It's still looking a little bit dark, and that's okay. Even though a lot of this still looks pretty much primer black. Actually need to hit that just a little bit. We've actually built quite a bit of green already. So there we go. All right. So I'm going to take this through the next step. This one's going to be a little bit easier, and then I'm going to introduce something a little bit, maybe a little bit more unfamiliar. Going back to our transparencies. So the next layer that I'm going to add is going to be Necrotite Green from P3. We're doing a pretty traditional workup here, since we're just using green colors so far. We're going to change that up a little bit, and I'll show you why. But for now, let's apply some Necrotite Green, and this is going to be in yet a smaller part of what we just did. So I'm going to knock this out really quick so we can get on to our next step. Try to keep this from falling down, fogging up my glasses. Again, applying very thin. Try to be very light on the trigger. So, also don't be afraid to get deep into your model. Get up close. If you get too close and you blow too much paint, you might get a little bit of splatter. But once you start getting a feel for it, you'll know when you're about to hit that threshold. So that's a practice sort of thing. But don't be afraid to get close. You can get pretty close. You can get some fairly tight lines, but it's still always going to be a little bit soft. It's always going to be a little bit fuzzy. And it's probably going to need a little bit of TLC afterwards, depending on what you're working on. Here's the best part. By the time we're done with this, we'll have a very large part of this mini actually painted, but it'll still take me like 20 plus hours to finish it, just because, well, that's me. So I'm taking very, very light. This is how light I'm taking it. You can see me building it up on the paper. Very light stabs at it. We're going to work in that tangent one more time, try to get those edges. Feel free to work in any details you think you might need as well. And if you need to go lighter on the air, if you feel more comfortable that way too, that's all good. A lot of people ask me what sort of PSI I run at. I usually run at somewhere between 25 to 30 PSI for everything I do. I've gotten comfortable enough that on the trigger of my airbrushes, I can push that down a little bit instead of all the way. If it's more comfortable for you to adjust your PSI at the compressor, do so. But most likely, eventually, with enough practice, you'll also get a good feel for that. And you can kind of lighten up off the air a little bit to get in and help you out with those details. So don't be afraid to practice with that. One of the biggest things for practicing with the airbrush is doing shapes, and this will help you out with that. If you don't know what I mean by doing shapes, one of the basic techniques that gets passed around a lot with airbrushers is really damn useful. Circle, dot, and line. So basically, you learn how to make a circle, you learn how to make a dot. There are practice sheets for this. Things like that. It's a good way to warm up if you're feeling a little bit out of practice whenever you sit down to paint. So if you're ever feeling a little less confident or you want something to help practice with detail work, that's a good place to start. All right, so you can see we've built it up to this point, and we've just used green. This is where gradients get really interesting. So I've used all of the same colors that I had used on our example mini, but we don't have the exact same tone yet. You notice this one looks a lot more muted than our example that we were working on before. This is where we start coming into playing around with your colors a little bit. Different colors have different ways that you can accent them. You can highlight and shade certain colors with different colors that enhance them. One of the things that I like to point out is how that green is really enhanced by using yellow. So since yellow is a part of green, and the way that we've taken our green, we've gone for a very warm green. So this is not a very cool green, we've gone for a very warm green. And so in that vein, we'll make it a little bit warmer, and we'll go for a warm yellow as a highlight. And if we needed to, we could use a cool blue to a purple as a shade tone. Often in this scheme, since I'm practiced with this, I bring in something called nightshade purple, which is nearly black. This is a very saturated color, so it doesn't look like black when you apply it. It looks a little bit different when you apply it over other colors. So that transparency that you get when you lay down these colors with anything, but especially with an airbrush, really starts to come into full effect when you look at these kind of final steps where you're looking at adding in your shade and your highlights. So this is going to be not quite our smallest concentric circle, but this is going to be probably our lightest. This is going to be our lightest layer, and we're actually going to thin this down quite a bit. This is going to be about 3/4 flow improver to 1 part flash gets yellow. But we're going to use this as a filter, and this filter is going to enhance what we've done on our gradient so far. Hopefully this is making sense as far as mechanically what I'm doing. The color aspect of it is a little bit harder and comes with a bit more practice as well. Another big example is that the purples that I use on this scheme, I generally I use pink to highlight them, and a different purple I can use blue to highlight them. So don't be afraid to play around with your colors. Color wheels are a great accessory. They'll give you some help and some hints on what you can potentially correlate in. But also don't feel like that's always what you have to do, or a hard rule either. It's more of like, you could do this, but the biggest thing to take out of that is just try to avoid using black and try to avoid using white. The reason I say that is it's kind of like there's nowhere else to go. I've heard other artists explain it a little bit better, and that you can't get any brighter than white. It's literally all the color, all on, right? Titanium white, ta-da. Same thing applies for black. And the way that it saps the color out of your minis might not look the way you want it to look. One of the biggest examples that I can think of is when people go to highlight red and they bring white into it, and then they turn out with a little bit of pink. It's not quite what they wanted. And why is that? That's because that pink is desaturating the red. Other things that you can do to highlight that red out, you can start leaning it towards yellow. You can make it into an orange. A lot of people use peach. Peach tones are a really good option for that as well. In fact, we'll talk about that on the second hour. But yeah, those are considerations to make. So you can see how the yellow that we've applied has really bumped up what looks like a very flat green here. We're using it as a filter. And again, this is about how quickly I'm building it up. That shows you anything? Yes, there is paint coming out. Oh, hold on. There was paint coming out. That's about as quickly as I'm applying it. You see those circles appearing. So let's do the same on the mini again. And I'm looking for places where I want the light to be more prominent. Alright. The fun thing is we accidentally put in a little bit of shadow here behind one of these horns up on the ridge, but that actually works in our favor. little inadvertent parts of the Mini that help out. One of the things to look for in this situation, when you're thinking about adding that shadow in by shooting the tangent, look at the topography of your model. You can generally see what you can and can't get to very easily with an airbrush, and then you'll also see some of those areas like that where, oh, that's a ridge, or you know, I want a little bit of shadow in here. There we go. So let's take a quick comparison to our example Mini again and see where that green has gone. There we go. So it's still, at this point, since this Mini's had a lot more work done on it, detail-wise, this is still looking a little flat. But we've managed to reach the same green tone on each one of them fairly quickly. And even with all the explanations in between, that only took us about 30 minutes to go through 4 different paints. And this is also something that really, if you're looking at an airbrush for batch painting, this is really the time where it comes in handy. If you had, say, 2 blow drones to do, it would be smart to do both of them at the same time. That way you don't waste as much paint in case you put a little bit extra in there. You just keep blasting through it all and kind of go down the line. And then it starts coming down to detail work. Another great thing to point out here too is that you don't necessarily have to quit using the airbrush once you've airbrushed this in. There's actually another step that I will break this in, but one of the things that I like to point out with this is that the purple parts on this Mini were airbrushed afterwards. So when we look at our example Mini again, the backside is violet and purple, and so are the weapons on this. The backside, literally what I did, I came in with a hairy brush. I blocked it in with violet, so all the parts that I wanted violet, I did, kind of like along the top ridge. And then I came back in and I worked the airbrush from there. So you can go in, lay something down by hand, and then go back over it with an airbrush and it'll look great. In fact, an airbrush is a great way to smooth out an uneven blend as well. So if you're having trouble with getting something blended by hand, sometimes you can sneak in the airbrush and a little touch there and kind of smooth it out. So the back sides of this were made using violet, sunset purple, and then Emperor's Children pink. So this is, again, using a corollary color. We went to pink, red, and violet for the deep recesses. On the front, on the weapons, we went a different direction. We actually went blue. So we went through violet to blue violet to blue horror from Citadel. So on the same Mini, we highlighted it 2 different ways, and we used the airbrush in both instances to get a little bit of that modulation. So you can see a little bit of a heat effect, a little bit of a glow effect there. So that's a big part to point out a little bit, is just when you're thinking about your shades and your highlights, they're not always going to be the same color. So again, we used yellow on our greens, we used blue and red on our purples, and we'll use some other things on other colors. It really just depends. And it not only depends on what color it is, it also depends on what the model is. So I also did say that we were going to take a look at an organic Mini as well. So let's see, how are we doing on time? 7:40, perfect. So this is another great example of a mini that you can get started and actually get a lot done with the airbrush before you even have to start looking at doing any sort of detail work. This is Karanak. He's a flesh hound, so it's all muscle, it's all fleshy bits here. There's a little bit of skull and fire down on the base, but for the most part, there's nothing metallic on him. I think the symbol here on the back is the only inorganic part. Oh, his collar. So let's start talking about how we want to do this. So traditionally, these flesh hounds from 40K are red color. Red is kind of a color that a lot of people don't like playing around with sometimes, just due to the highlighting aspect of it. It can be a bit tough, and then also red paints tend to be a little bit difficult to build up without getting too blocky. So one of the things that we're actually going to look at doing here is playing around with some of those corollary colors. When I said that you wouldn't necessarily want to use black in your shadows, one of the reasons that I say that is that if you put black in there, it will look flat. It will look like there's no color underneath, because even in pitch darkness, or what we would consider pitch darkness, there's still some sort of light, there's still some sort of color, etc. It looks weird if something is just a flat black. It looks desaturated. It looks it's artificial. So one of the other things that we can do here is we can actually play with complementaries. I'm going to break out some of that Misfits green again, and we're going to undercoat this, going back to what we discussed with the thinness of our paints. I'm going to undercoat this with our forest green. The end result that we're going for is going to be a traditionally red hellhound here. So let me get that mixed up. Let's put the brush back on. I'm going to take a sip of my beverage, and then we're going to base that in. Poor Karanak here needs some paint. He's awful lonely being unpainted here on my desk. Cheers. All right. Got some nice green coming through. Let's do it. So I'm going to assume that the light is coming down kind of towards his face a little bit. Faces a little bit. So kind of coming in at this direction. So that's where I'm going to hold the airbrush. And I'm going to very lightly block him in with some green. Now his ridges are blocking a little bit here. That's okay. Taking it nice and thin. Probably barely see my airbrush because I'm keeping it at a distance here so I can get some nice wide swaths of paint applied. And I'm not, just like with the previous one, I'm not worried about getting this thing completely green. I just need a hint. Go, just giving it a spritz here and there, a little bit there, a little bit here. Good times. Build a little bit more green where the light should be stronger. There we go. All right. That feels good. All right, so now we can get rid of our green. That was literally just for the undercoat. And now we're gonna have to start bringing in some red. Let's play around with it. Let's go Let's go all in with our bright... should we? Yeah, why not? Let's go in with our bright red. This is Bold Pearl Red from Monument. It's kind of a, not really scarlet, very, very rich red, though. Oops, let's get a little bit of flow improver. I need to have this very thin. I'm going for about a 3 to 4 parts flow improver to 1 part Bold Pearl Red here. So if you want to see what it looks like, just like that, and then I mix it up. Looks pretty saturated, but we'll take that nice and thin. That was 2 drops of paint. All right. Hopefully you can see that being applied. Oh, good grief. Sorry, my mask keeps falling down. There we go. Taking this extremely slow. And I'm taking it kind of from a top-down angle. And I'm trying not to come in on the sides because I want to preserve the shadows caused by the ridges of the model itself. So we're using the topography of the model to help us mask it off. Create a little bit of extra detail. Oh, my lovely wife and my dog coming in to visit. No screen behind me. Just a reminder. All right, so now we've basically covered the model in a bit of red. He's nice and deep, and we can start bringing this up just a little bit more. If we keep taking it nice and thin, like we will, or like we have, we'll keep getting a nice, rich red tone. Leaving as much of that green and dark primer in the recesses as we can. Shoot the tangent just a little bit here on his frills. So we want to make sure we get a little bit of that red tone in on each of the frills because we're gonna airbrush those in as well. That'll be a little bit different. But you should see right now we've got a nice rich red building up. Build it up a little bit more on this leg. Trying to hit it in a few target spots. Just the spreads. So, what did that get us? Well, if I had tried to build up Bold Pearl Red directly over this, it would be very thin and splotchy. Instead, what we got was we've gotten a very saturated undertone with that green, and in 2 steps we brought it up to almost the red that we want it to. The shadows themselves, because they've got a little bit of that green and a little bit of that red kind of spritzed in on them, they're not black. They're going to look a lot more saturated, especially under natural light. So let's block this in just a little bit more. I want a little bit more saturation here with the red. And what we're going to do next is actually bring in some highs on the red and build in the frills. So we were discussing that we don't want to bring red or white or pink into this, so we're going to work on a different different color tone. But let's see, how are we looking on time? Laura, do we want to go ahead and take our break here, and then we can pick up the next highlight tones and stuff after the break? Sounds great. So I'm going to take a 10-minute break, everyone. I'm going to use... All right, cool. See you all in 10. All right, welcome back everybody. Hopefully everyone had a great break and got everything that they needed taken care of. Let's get right back to it. So before we went on break, we were taking a quick look at how to get a nice saturated base coat here on an organic mini. We used our Misfits green as a base layer, and then we actually brought in bold Purell red here as a secondary red. It's a little dull at the moment, so I'm actually going to bring in a little bit more Purell red now that it's dried up a little bit, and then we're going to bring in an awesome highlight color, and that's going to piggyback off of the bold Purell red just a little bit. So again, we're using some Pro-Acryl red. We're going to mix that in nice and thin. There we go. We'll go ahead and enhance his skin tones just a little bit more. And we're going to take this mostly from a top-down perspective, just like we did with the previous layers. So there's nothing wrong with going back to the same color that we used before, especially in mid-tone. We just need to add a little bit more of that color into the mix. A little bit more red. So since we have the green and the red before, we have a nice complementary that turns into a nice neutral brown. A neutral brown. And then, yeah. Again, nice and easy, nice and thin. Trying to make sure you can see me where I'm actually airbrushing, and we're going to shoot the tangent here. You notice it's giving us a little bit of shade as we do this. Since we're hitting it from one side and not the other side, you'll notice we have shade here, but we have brightness here. This is simply a matter of where you hold the airbrush. The airbrush is going this way, not this way. So that's part of how we get some of our modulation and our gradients again. So now that I've got that done, I'm actually going to empty out most of that, just like we did before. We're going to sour mash in our next paint color here. So we've got a little bit of our bold Purell red, and at this point, I'm going to bring in tan flesh. So this is a nice peachy tone, nice and high value, and we're going to put a drop of that in there. Not much, just a little bit. So this will keep us from completely desaturating our red, but we still have to be a bit careful with it. This is a great alternative for using something like white for your reds, which will make it a lot more pink. Another option you can actually use, going back to what we just discussed, might be a little too pink, but that's okay. We'll actually go up another layer after this. I like that as a mid-flesh tone. Another option, you can actually add green. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but same thing as what you would do with a traditional brush, you can do with an airbrush. You can highlight this out with something desaturated like Sherwood green. You could even go so far as to go up to something like autumn green. What's the one I actually do? Like spring green. Damn it. I love this for red. So this is another alternative instead of using a peachy flesh tone. That will give you a different overall look though, so that's not what we want for this mini. Oh, and I'm going to go in super, super light. Let me get that on camera for you. Sorry, there is a fly driving me crazy tonight. right. So, might be thinking, hey, that looks a little desaturated still. You're right. So we're going to go back to, again, our bold pearl red. It's going to drop out. Damn it. Well, I screwed that mix up. Hey. Wanted more red, not peach. I'm just adding a little bit of that red back in over that peach. Oh, I got a little bit of water in my line. Yes, I do have a water trap. If you're curious what a water trap is, it's very necessary. Keeps water out of your line. It's not 100% effective, but it will save paint jobs. So if you do not have a water trap on your airlines, it's worth the extra $15. A lot of compressors, especially hobby compressors, come with one, so it's a good start. I have two. I've actually backed water into the airbrush at this point. So you can see we're going over the highlighted tones that we just added, and we're adding back in our bold pearl red. So not only did we use it as a highlight, we used it as basically an undercoat to help bump up the red. There you go. Now we've got a nice bright crazy red. We can go a little bit. Further on this mini, and I'd kind of like to show you a little bit more. Let's go ahead and work on his frills here just a little bit. And I want to show you why I would say don't worry too much about getting a bit of overspray. So you notice that we colored in the frills. That's on purpose. The frills aren't going to remain that color though. We just did it because we want to make a nice transition into them. We want to make it nice and smooth. They're eventually going to be kind of a fleshy color, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break out some of my mahogany paint. Taking a nice thin layer of mahogany. And we're going to go ahead and work some tones into this. Again, we're not looking for exact paint placement. We're just getting it kind of in the right spot. Oops. All right, let's bump it up just a little bit. Take a little bit more of that mahogany, a little bit less thinned down. Let's take it a little bit heavier. I'm just gonna put it directly in the brush. You can put paints directly in the brush. You do not have to always thin your paint, but 99% of the time you'll want to thin it.
So I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible so we can keep moving. You'll notice that the brown tone that we're adding here is getting mixed in with the red quite a bit. But that's so we set up more of our following tone here. Again, this is all about undercoating, all about building your colors up in a managed fashion. And even though I'm going in with a lot of plans here, don't be afraid to play around a little bit. If something doesn't work, it doesn't work. You can always throw a little bit more paint on it. You can always back it out a little bit. I'd say probably the worst case scenario that you'd run into with airbrushing is take it back down to primer. So literally prime over what you've done and spot fix it, right? So we're applying a little bit of this tan flesh now. We're taking it real easy over that brown. Now, since we've added the mahogany over the red, we have a more neutral tone to work with as an undercoat, and this doesn't look so pink. Doesn't look like a high orangey pinkish red. We've got a nice flesh tone starting to work in. We're doing this around the other airbrush work. And since we added in those nice colors, we're also getting a decent transition in here. The airbrush is fuzzy. And so are gradients. We get a little bit of overspray here. That's not a big deal. It's probably easier to go in and try to fix it by hand with a hand brush rather than the airbrush. But you know, whatever's most comfortable for you. So what we essentially did here is what I'm going to show you next in 2D. But we just did in 3D. An actual transition from red to peach, and we did it using a transitionary tone. We used mahogany. That mahogany allowed us to transition between them without getting oversaturated with the red into the tan flesh. So I want to show you how I'm thinking about this, but maybe in a little bit less of a mini-centric way. Got a nice flesh tone worked up there. What I can do from now is start to work some shade back in with some washes, with some glazes, a little bit of layering, a little bit of edging here, and we can take it from there. This is actually not the end of the airbrushing that I want to do, though. But I'm going to keep that for later. But this is to the point where I've got the basic skin tone that I want locked in, and I can take it from here however I want. I would start working in details like the teeth, the ridges, stuff like that. And if I do need to go back in, if I find that something doesn't look quite right with the airbrush, that is okay. There's nothing stopping me there. So one of the things that I do want to show you, and I'm going to show you this in 3D, is how to do a gradient between two different colors that may not necessarily make sense when you look at them. And this is kind of, a lot of people would probably say this is my specialty, and we actually broke out some of these colors earlier and talked about them, but I want to show you in a 3D way. I want to show you how I can do a gradient between these two colors. And what we're going to do to bring those two colors together is go through a transitionary color. I don't want to use that. I want to use this. So we're gonna do that through a transitionary color. And how do we do that? Well, I've got a couple of midtones out to do so, but I want to basically go from a solid violet to this Iosin green. Let's take a look at one way of doing that. We mentioned that we can use undercoating.
And this is probably one of the easiest ways to think about how to transition from one color to another color, because you're going to want to think about what color you're putting over the other, and what goes into the what goes into the actual mid-tone itself. Because at some point, with any transition, any gradient, one color is going to overlap another color. So, one of the things I like to do is set them up for success by using a transitionary color. One of my triplets that I love using, and that's what we were starting to use on the bloat drone, is our green, yellow, purple triplet. These work great together, and they can be used as a, or one of these can be used as a transitionary tone for the other two. So what I'm actually going to do is lay down the transition tone first. Is this necessarily the way you'll always want to do it? No. In fact, another option I could do here that would be perfectly acceptable is to start off with our Misfits green that we want to, or I'm sorry, our Iosin green that we want to transition to, and using that as an undercoat going into the purple. But that would slightly change the way the entire panel looks. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, it's just you have different options. The big thing is that because of the way that color theory works, these are going to be a win. Now, can I tell you what would work in every situation? What works in every color? No. A color wheel will help you plan that out, but that's also not. So one way is to pivot off of your mid-tone, your transition tone. The other way is to start with one tone and move to the other. And a third way is to actually transition through a neutral tone like black, gray, or white. So I can show you a little bit of each, funny enough. Go ahead and start with this though. I'm going to break out some of our Averland Sunset. This is a Citadel paint. This is basically a foundation paint that are up and down. And this is a very strong ochre yellow. So while this may not be like a straight pure yellow, it does the job, and it does something. It makes for a great paint. See the shine there? We've got a moisture. I'm putting on a piece of India to show you what I'm doing. And I'm gonna give that just a moment to dry. Where I'm going. I'm gonna put our over here. And you know what? I'm actually going to cheat a little bit tonight. I'm going to use my second. Don't worry. It's nice having two airbrushes and a quick disconnect to swap your hose and stuff between them. It's not necessary, but it just saves a little bit of time. I know a lot of people tend to get like a starter airbrush and then move to a higher level airbrush later when they feel more comfortable. That's a good time to get quick disconnects and have the other one kind of on hand to do some of your work while the other one is doing, like, your main work. But that's all I'm doing. Also, just trying to explain things while I'm loading up paint, the boring stuff. We've got some of our Iosin green loaded up now, and I think this is just about dry. Flow Improver tends to take the dry time up on paint, while thinner takes it down. That's a factor of Flow Improver having glycerin in it, which slows down your dry times as well as being a surfactant. And then thinner is basically the same thing with alcohol. Alcohol tends to make things dry faster. All right, so I've got my Iosin green. I'm going to start on one edge, and we're going to overcoat the Averland Sunset. So since we've got a nice secondary color in our green, into our yellow, I'm just taking this super thin. So you can see how we're getting that hint of green there. A little bit line. And this is where I'd go back and maybe touch it up with the other one a little bit. Something like that. All right. So just like we did before, I'm not going to completely dump out my green paint here. I'm going to keep a little bit of that in there, and I'm going to move up to my necrotite green. It's going to be our final green for the transition. So just like we did with the yellow, setting up our next layer with the previous layer. We did black paint to start off with for the ochre. And we put a little bit of iosine green over the ochre side, and we used that very thinly so we lay off the ochre. Same thing here. This is how, same basic concept for every airbrush transition gradient. Super thin, lay off the layer. You can't use the color with enough time and patience, but it tends to and we can move this green into the other parts of this as well. But yeah, there we go. One thing you're probably not seeing me do too much when I'm spraying, I'm basically doing this to distribute the paint spray. I don't want to sit the paint in one spot too long. I want to even it out. So small circles, back and forth, nice passes like this. Those are things that you're going to want to do. That applies to minis, that applies to you basically just don't want to build up too much paint in one spot. And that also helps keep it nice over a flat surface like this. I'm admittedly not a very steady hand. It's taken a lot of practice to get to where I'm at, and a lot of learning how to brace my hands. But this is like the time to embrace that a little bit, and you want to actually move your hand around quite a bit. Is it controlled to an extent, but not fully? You don't need to make sure you know where all of the paint is going. All right, we're going to completely switch out our paint here. We're going to move on to Sunset Purple from Scale 75. This is going to be the opposite. The agitator stuck in the bottle. Oh my goodness, am I actually out of this? Wow. Alright, well there's yeah. And thank you, Tabletop Gaming Hobby, for keeping that Sunset Purple in stock. Like that. That's a smooth transition. That's a lovely thing. Alright. Let's get this out here. Alright, so we're gonna go for the other side now. We're gonna transition into purple. This is our Sunset Purple. And because purple is a complementary to yellow, it plays out well here over the ochre. I'm trying to make this as smooth as possible while a fly attacks my face. This is fantastic. Get out of here, fly. I don't know what the deal is with this fly, but I'm gonna try to airbrush him if he gets too frisky. You're asking for it, fly. I see you. Go. And we're gonna swap back over to our ochre, and we're gonna work that mid-tone, that part of that transition back in. These are the same kind of concepts that technically apply to traditional brushing, just with all the caveats and ideas with the airbrush tool itself behind it.
super thin. I'm having to check my brush and stuff too. Get back to both and purple. So there you go. This is how you do a simple transition between two wildly different colors. We've got on one side, and you could theoretically use the same color on the side of like a scale model, or fantastic. Give it some interesting colors. And with other colors too. Don't feel like it's necessarily reliant on these colors working together as a triplet or a triad. Let's try something out. We mentioned a moment ago. I'm going to clear these brushes out. We mentioned a moment ago about using a neutral tone as a transition. I'm going to try to do so. I have no idea what colors I want to work with, though. So let's pick something out. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and set up a spot here real quick on the other side. Okay. I've just got out some primer. If you're curious what primer I like using, oops. If you're curious what primer I like using, it's Stynylrez from Badger. I can't remember. Well, I don't know. I don't think TableTop's actually had this. Vallejo primer works just as well. The surface primer, an airbrush, as it does through a hand brush. But I like the Stynylrez a little bit better for the airbrush. If you're wondering. Clear that out. Let's pick out some random colors. Oh, I know. Got our red. Let's do a red to blue transition. I have done before. So when you're looking at red to blue, you've technically got two colors that could potentially work together. Going through something like purple, but purple's a very strong tone. And then on top of that, you may be going for a lighting effect. One of the things that, oh man, I should have brought reference material with me. One of the minis that I've done recently was a two-tone lighting deal where I did red on one side and blue on the other. If I had gone through a transition of purple, it wouldn't have looked correct because then it wouldn't have looked like light. It would have looked, it wouldn't have looked like directional light. It would have looked like just ambient diffuse light around the model instead. So to do this, the basic idea is that we have that same transition that we just built, but instead of using a transitionary color, we go back through with neutral tone like black. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this up. Do this quick. Add that other. Because this one's killing me tonight. Sorry, guys. All right. Red on this side. So I'm breaking out burnt red from Pro Acryl. It's a very not a very desaturated, but a very deep, rich, dark red. And I'm gonna bring it in on this side. So the same concept applies here. I'm going to get a nice rich piece. Get up a little bit. Middle. Bring it that way. Go ahead. Switch out other airbrush. Let's let's work in some of our dark. Got some Pro Acryl dark blue. I'm working with a lot of Pro Acryl paint. If you need some color matching or anything, hit me up. Absolutely addicted to these bracelets. There we go. All right, dark blue. Let's do it. We've got a nice smear at this point, right? And we've come in with some dark tones. So now we've got a nice undercoat for red, we've got a nice undercoat for our blue, and we've got a nice neutral mid-tone black. So let's enhance it out, and then we'll bring in the shade. Bump it up and knock it down. Usually the direction I take when I'm looking at a project as far as what order I'm going in. I'll bring it all the way to the highest point I want it, and then I will add shadows back in. Because when I go back to cut things in with the hand brush, I can always add some more. And it will be a little bit more. Let's bring in pants blue. Pants are always blue. That's what I learned from Mario. Go. And that. This out. Let's get our bold curl red out again. Again, super quick. I really need to make a video for everyone on how I empty my airbrush. It feels like one of those knowledges that people kind of pass around but don't really talk too much about. I know one of my problems is that it's equipment below my desk, so yeah, that might be something I need to do for you guys at some point. There's a lot of that sort of thing that people don't really talk about, or there's assumptions, I guess, on like what you do. So we approach that middle area, nice and light. Try to keep it as even as possible. All right, so now we've got these two colors. It looks okay. Let's go back to our mid-tone, our transition. We said we're going for a neutral. We're going for a neutral transition tone this time. We're going to do what I. Actually, you know what? We're not going to do what I said not to do. We're going to do something a little bit different. I mentioned Nightshade Purple here. This is from Reaper. We're going to use this. Even though I said we're not going to use purple, this isn't necessarily like. But this is a very deep dark saturated. I'll show you here in just a second. That's what it looks like. That's purple, believe it or not. Reaper makes a number of really nice saturated tones. Their liners, their liners, deep example for those other tones. They make really good. They make really good airbrush tones like this. That make so, like that. Making wide circles with my airbrush and smoothing out that transition right in the All right, and that is basically how you do a transition between two wildly different colors using a neutral tone in the middle. Now, like I mentioned, that neutral tone can be anything. Black is a good one. White can technically be used, and so can gray. It looks a little weird, a little different, specialty things. Brown is another good choice as well. So if you're working in things, great examples are green. Browns are transitionary tone for those. Especially since when you think about what you can bring in as a transition, you can also think about these complements. Bringing in, for example, in that case, if you're doing a transition tone between red and you, mahogany is the muddy sort of brown. Use that to your advantage. You know, there is a reason why we have all the crazy stuff ready to go. There's people use a lot of shades, tones, and hints of other colors in them. That being said, oh, perfect. I'd love to open up for any questions. I know we've got a couple of people hanging out there at this point. But yeah, let's also just hit up a couple of other things I wanted to show you. I can get out as examples for airbrushing. We were talking a bit about our violet tones as well. So look at this. So another big thing that's a target for a lot of airbrush artists is cloth. This is another great opportunity to focus on those shadow tones, since there's a lot of texture in capes and stuff. So one of the things that we tend to do, we were discussing it a bit earlier, is to bring in your traditional brush, go ahead and block something in, to show you kind of what I was talking about when you get a little store on the consistency of that and how you go about fixing it. So I'm literally just going to get out my Vallejo model color violet and funny minis to practice on. I know these are literally just things that we gotta work on. We're gonna break out Abaddon to spoil them. We're gonna paint his cape. Well, technically violet. We're painting his cape violet. Is this brush big enough? Sure. So real super example how to combine your brush work a little bit here without getting too complicated. So you can see how quickly I'm trying to apply this, and I'm applying this very randomly, very it might even take a little bit to dry fully before we want to airbrush it. But I'm also trying to show you, I'm trying to do this thick and scratchy enough. Kind of some inconsistent textures here. So that tries. Get this in too. We can hit that there. It's actually probably a good example.
let's let that dry for just a moment. Let me crack out our airbrush one more time, just for the air. Another great thing to use your airbrush for, if you don't have a heat tool or a heat tool is inappropriate, an airbrush just pushing air is nice and handy for helping things to dry out. It's currently 82.8 degrees Fahrenheit in here. Wow, that is kind of warm. And 45% humidity. So that's slowing down our dry time just a little bit on the humidity. Just drying this off a little bit. I'm pushing some paint around. Oh no, I'm creating texture. Terrible thing. Oh look, we've got some spottiness there. We've got some brush strokes and spottiness around the back as well. Perfect. So, it's not super bad in this case, but this is another thing you can really use your airbrush for, is to correct some of your inconsistencies in your base tones, and that doesn't necessarily always mean the base tone either. Let's go ahead and get some violet into our airbrush. Put the mask back on, and I'll show you how easy it is to kind of smooth this out. Just a couple thin layers, and then we'll work it up just a little bit. Show you how I go about doing the cape. If I can get it done in time. So we've got some spottiness here on the inside. Let me make sure you guys can see that. So we didn't get it completely covered, but we can go in nice and easy. Just start working that in where we didn't get it applied. You want to try to blend it in just like we did with the transitions, but you don't want to go so heavy that you apply spots of paint. You don't want to accumulate paint on your mini. It should be drying almost a few seconds after it hits the mini itself. Use that air from the airbrush if you need to, but yeah. So we've got some inconsistencies down here. And let's look at the back. So we've got some texture. I think you can see that on camera. Back here where I just slapped the brush on it. I'm going to take it nice and thin, just like this. And a few passes over that texture just disappears. Spot there that we missed. Go. Right, so now we've corrected our base layer. The next thing that I traditionally do in my my violet workup like this, I actually start going into a purple tone. This is where I bring out my sunset purple. One of the reasons that I love talking about tones is that they are for that kind of tool that you can bring in and fix almost anything. If you ever feel like, and I'm going to show you this, if you ever feel like your highlights, etc., a little too far in your airbrushing scheme, bring back your midtone. Bring in what you did. That will be the nice median. I'm going to take this top down a little bit. So remember when we were angling things? Same thing. I'm going to get some angled paint in here. And build up slowly. A little bit of paint build up there. The easy rainer. And we're gonna hit the areas getting more light. So again, concentrically up where we believe we're getting more light.
value, more volume. So we're building saturation and volume. We're adding color and light. So this is where our violet is actually turning into a purple. That undertone of the violet is going to look way different than if I had just put down the sunset purple over black primer. I can show you. Let me give you a good example. What does it look like over black primer? Like this. Dry for a second. And you can see that's a much saturated tone than what we built. It's very dark, desaturated. And it would take some work to get it looking solid. Hopefully I'm not missing anything. Oh, we're good. Oh, drop. Stop it. He's a little off kilter. My apologies. So, I want to show you how to break out our other airbrush. We're gonna break and highlight. So, I mentioned that I use pink in my purples. So I only use one purple in my purple workup, and that's the mid-tone. I'm actually going to bring in Emperor's Shoulder Pink next as a high tone. So this is going to be kind of like how we use the yellow on our green. I'm going to bring this in and kind of desaturate out a little bit, bringing up the value at the same time. Flow improver, lots of flow improver, very thin. Bright tones, things like Flash Gets Yellow, Emperor's Children Pink, a lot of whites, a lot of off-whites tend to chunk up. So you can add a lot of flow improver to them before they break, which is nice, but they will break at some point. All right, so we're bringing in very thin amounts of pink. This is where I want the light to be. And that's the way I gotta think about it. See, I'm taking nice smooth passes at it. And I'm trying to follow the topography of the model. Oops. Got a little bit of tip clog here. Let me fix that. I use my toothbrush to do that, if you're wondering. Here, let me move the model. This is what I do when I do this. I literally do this. Clear. Oh man. log there. Just trying to finish this up real quick. There we go. All right, so we've got a nice purple cloak for Abaddon here. Now, it's a little high value for me in a couple of spots. Let's even out the fuzziness. I'm bringing back in my mid-tone. This is our Sunset Purple. Kind of like how we went over some of the things earlier. You can see that I'm using that to bring some color back into the areas where we applied pink. So our pink areas look a little bit more purple saturated again. This one especially, this one looks really washed out. So if it's looking washed out, blend in with the mid-tone. All right, so there we go. How are we doing on time, Laura? We still got 5 minutes or so. Perfect. I wanna bring in one last thing here, but hopefully you can see how that mid-tone brought back some of the high values into that look here we've got going on. That way, if you ever run into a situation where you feel like you're getting a little too desaturated, something looks a little too cotton candy, looks a little too fuzzy, looks a little too washed out, just go over it. Use it as an undercoat. If you're familiar with zenithal pre-shading, it's the same kind of concept. You're just using the undercoat here to carry to the top coat. So one last thing I can do here before we wrap up, we can always add some more shadow back in. Like I said, don't be afraid to add some shade into your finished work. It's usually the last step that I bring into a mini when I'm airbrushing it, is to look for where we can apply some shadows. It doesn't take a whole lot, it doesn't take much. And again, try to use colors that are dark, but not necessarily black. If you do need to mix black into one of your colors to make a darker version of it, that is fine. Just see if you can mix more and more color into it as you go without making it brighter. That saturation helps the overall look. So I'm coming in here and I'm hitting the insides with a very thin amount of this light shade purple. And we're going to get some extra depth out of the ridges here. This is where we get extra volume out of the topography of the mini. So this is something that's going to take some practice to get down, but just pick out minis like this. Get something with some cloaks or some dresses or shirts, skirts, lots of clothing. It's really fun to play around with the fold like this. Hopefully that's looking a little bit more electric than it was just a few minutes ago. Now that being said, you can take the color however you want. The same concepts apply here. I tend to go for a very striking contrast in my own painting. I'm not driving it as striking to puff my own ego, just for the description of I like a lot of contrast color-wise and value-wise. But I think that puts us right where we want to be for tonight. And that's what I wanted to. That's really what I wanted to go over with you all tonight. So thank you so much for having me. Let's take a quick look at what we were discussing. So we did a couple of different examples. As an example on how to build up a slow gradient in a single color sort of way. We went through green. We also showed how we can use yellow as a filter through the airbrush to tint a color. At the very end, we made our green a lot more poppy by adding a little bit of yellow.
We also worked on this mini here, and we base coated this in using green, and then followed up by using red and flesh tones for highlights and transitions into its frills. And then we also worked on this mini's cloak just now to show you how to bring in a high tone and bring in a shadow and kind of correct those, as well as how to base coat with a traditional brush and just correct out brush strokes. So, thank you all for joining me. It's been a fantastic evening. I appreciate the company and the opportunity, of course. Besides all that, I will hopefully, all willing, I'll be back for some more. And if you have any particular subjects, concerns, questions, feel free to contact me either here on Twitch, I'm Rainer72, through Tabletop Game and Hobby. Obviously, they know how to reach me, or even on Discord or other social media. So thank you so much. And Laura, do you have anything for the outro for us? Oh.